Hello, everyone. Professor Stevenson here. It is Sunday night. I feel I don't know. It's Oscar night. It's True Detective season finale night. And so I'm feeling very pumped tonight. Yeah, if you don't watch the Oscars or True Detective, that's okay. I won't hold it against you. I'm kind of obsessed with True Detective, and it's the season finale, so I am just like waiting to watch it over here. Very exciting. Funny thing is, we had meetings on Monday and Tuesday, and most of you who live in Minnesota were talking to me about the snow. If you get an opportunity, Google, or if you have Phoenix relatives, it snowed in Phoenix. So the mountains just north of me snowed. My sister-in-law works at a country club on a mountain as a pastry chef, and if you know anything about the restaurant industry, restaurants never closed. Restaurants and food service, they had to close because the road conditions were too bad in Phoenix. Now, obviously, in Minnesota, it probably wouldn't have been an issue because you all have snowplows and we do not have those things. So I just want to let you know that there were people in the state last Thursday and Friday who had snow days. Not kids at school, not most schools, in fact. Schools that lacked infrastructure and places of work that had to go up a snowy mountain without snowplows. So I don't know, maybe this is like good penance for me making jokes or saying, it's 55 here and it's really cold. So anyway, one of the things I wanted to start the wrap up talking about a little bit is I wanted to talk a little bit about the teaching philosophy assignment. So I'm looking at the syllabus. The draft of it is due in week 9. So we're in week 6. So you have a couple of weeks. Obviously, it's after spring break that this is due. But if you were in class with me, I would be like, who here has ever written a teaching philosophy? And some people would raise their hand. If you haven't, it's a good place to start. Really practically, I know that jobs that I apply for, I have been actively trying to get a full-time position at the community colleges here in Arizona teaching. They're actually the best jobs in the state for full-time teaching professionals. I'm not a tenure track professor, and because I got my PhD at ASU, they would not hire me as a tenure track professor. So I'm an instructor. So the majority of work that I do is instruction, and it's the work that I like to do. I like to work with students, and the best paying and the best sort of chances for advancements are at the community college. And so I've been applying for those jobs. They're super competitive for about a billion years, it feels like now, and I've been a finalist in a couple. But yeah, one of the exercises to applying for jobs is, I don't know about high school teaching, but in college teaching, they ask for a lot of documents. They ask for a CV, they ask obviously a cover letter, and the cover letter is a very type of specific letter. Sometimes they ask for writing samples or assignment samples, and a teaching philosophy is one of those documents. And so it's a good practice. It's a good thing to get in the practice of writing this document. So if you don't have one already, this is a good opportunity for you to start. If you do have this might be an opportunity to start revising, considering the ideas that you're thinking about in this class. So it's 10% of your grade. I'm asking you, there are about 500 to 1,000 words. I want to say my teaching philosophy is about 500 words. I'll talk about the second option of the assignment called a creative map. And that is for those of you who don't think you want to go into teaching or perhaps aren't comfortable writing a teaching philosophy right now. So it's a reflective statement of your beliefs about teaching and learning. Your teaching philosophy will discuss how you put your beliefs into practice using concrete examples. So, for example, I'm into expressive. I follow expressivist pedagogy. I think it's really important for students to learn their voice in class. And then you would give an example of what that's like. And so that's kind of that. So those of you who teach writing, there's a both like show and tell here. So you're going to tell, and it's probably tell and then show. So you're going to tell them sort of your philosophy behind teaching, and use this opportunity to use some of these buzzwords that you learned. They're really great. Again, they're really great with search committees, right? Like you're trying to get a job. And this is an opportunity to illustrate some of the things that you're learning, or some of the things that you're learning to articulate in this class. A lot of you are not just dealing with new ideas. Some of you are adding language to ideas that you've been teaching for a little while or even a long time. So this is one of those things, like if you all are taking this class for professional development or towards a master's degree to, add more professional development, the teaching philosophy is an opportunity to kind of strut your stuff. And then possibly, again, I think it's a really, having a strong teaching philosophy that's able to leverage some of the concepts in the field of composition is really helpful, and I think is a really good skill to have on an application and to see a search committee on. So that's one audience, would be a search committee. The second audience would be your colleagues. The teaching philosophy serves as a formative purpose, a document that helps you reflect on and improving your teaching. So starting this can be difficult, right? And so what I've done in the assignment sheet is really kind of outline some steps that you have taken. So getting started, like what I'd like you to do, I think if you've never written one, it's a good opportunity to start with this assignment sheet. What's your concept of learning? Number 2, what's your concept of teaching? What's your goal for teachers? What methods will you consider to reach these goals and objectives? And so this is where you start talking about the composition pedagogies and theories we've been learning. And one of the teaching philosophies that I've looked at from another scholar in the field kind of really takes 2. Like it almost is like 2 of the chapters in Guide to Composition Pedagogies. It's like feminist pedagogy and new media pedagogy. And she doesn't exactly say that, but she's like, these are 2 guiding principles for my teaching. And she really illustrates those. So she tells and then shows. And then your interaction with students. What are your attitudes towards advising and mentoring too? So that's getting you started on a teaching example. Specific. So you want to like really rely on 2 specific examples. If you say you use feminist pedagogy in your classroom and it involves, a decentered learning practice, what are some examples? Like what's an activity in class, or what's the way that your class is structured to talk about that? I don't know if it's in this newest iteration, but I talk about using assessment throughout the class to help myself check in with students and students to check in with themselves. So we do a couple of different types of assessments. I'm commenting on writing that I'm not grading. And then they're also giving me kind of these mid-semester evaluations where they evaluate themselves and me. So I can look and see at stuff like that so that we can improve mid-semester if we need to. If they're not getting out of the class if they're putting in a lot and not getting out a lot what they need to. And that's the kind of stuff that I would put in a teaching philosophy. So then the job would be to organize this. And one of the examples I said was to write a paragraph covering each, your concept of teaching, your learning, your goals for students, and they would become 8 major sections. And then obviously if they seem really disjointed, you could think about also organizing by themes. So there's a couple of resources on the assignment sheet. I would definitely take a look at those. The creative map, again, if you don't plan on teaching you can write a creative map of composition theories for your project. It has no really set format, but I ask you to draw a chart, display, collage, or otherwise demonstrate your understandings of the definitions, theories, schools, and evolutions of composition theories. Sorry, this says weekly micro themes, but like your weekly discussions, you can do this in a number of different ways. You can write, sound, collage, Prezi, etc. And this is on the assignment sheet. You'll find an example Prezi that covers a much longer period, but it kind of gives an example. So I'm available if you want to have a chat about this via email or via the phone or via video conference if you have questions or something. But otherwise, I'd say take a stab at it. If you've never done it before, I get it. It's really hard to start. But for any of you, like a couple of you talked about applying to PhD programs and stuff, having a teaching philosophy in your back pocket, because, if you apply to be a TA in a program, that they want it, even if you've never taught. When I applied for my TA, they asked for a teaching philosophy, and I was all of 23 years old. And I was like, I've never taught a day in my life. But it all worked out. And I've developed and revised it. So I try to go and revise it. If I'm not applying for a job, I try to go and revise my teaching philosophy at least once a year. So on to this week's discussion. And I've already realized I've taken about 10 minutes, so I'm going to try to be brief. So I might not get to talking about what all of you said. First of all, Ashley asked some really great questions. I think, honestly, this is one of the strengths of having you guys lead the discussions, is your questions are so thoughtful. And some of them are things that don't drive an agenda that I would always have thought to ask, but that's okay. So a couple of you talked about the feminist composition study stuff. Michelle talked about sort of feminist works that were feminist before we coined the term feminist. And she said the term feminist is recent in and of itself. So it's important that students see that feminism existed before the term was coined. Excuse me, I'm gonna sneeze. Sorry. That activism and philosophies behind it were in motion centuries before the first wave of the feminist movement. And I think that that's kind of what Jackie Rhodes is getting at, is there's a mainstream feminism that kind of covers up a lot of different things. And the way that she's talking about it is how it operates in composition studies, because we have sort of a way of being a feminist, or a way of teaching that's feminist, that sort of discloses or cuts off a lot of other different ways of being a feminist. So I thought that was interesting. And Lori, I think, kind of gets at this when she's like, yeah, I don't like this binary stuff. Like, there's masculine and feminine. And her idea of a teacher is, or her own personal idea, not like she needs this other person to be like this, is students need teacher coaches who are knowledgeable and authoritative, not authoritarian. She said her writing pedagogy is to be warm and culturally sensitive, authoritative teacher and coach who listens, responds, and offers strategies to students while expecting them to complete assignments. Let's see. Who else touched on the feminism question? See, there's one more. I already talked about feminist pedagogy is not a discrete set of practices, but a flexible basis which to launch intersectional pedagogical project, not just sex alone. Feminism, she talks about, has an assumed combination and their connotation that it rarely gets understood beyond the surface. Feminine versus masculine qualities, right? Like, we kind of emotion. So she takes this quote from the Guide to Composition Pedagogies: emotion is bound up with judgment, belief, ideology, and social life broadly conceived. It is the grounds of self-other relations, an inescapable element of all cultural institutions. So I think you all are There is, so some of you take it in a kind of higher theory way, but some of you take it in like, what does it look like to be they're a feminist teacher. There actually used to be a whole journal. I think it's stopped publishing, but it was called Feminist Teacher. And if any of you are doing projects like this, even if you don't want to use the F word, right? Because that's a buzzword apparently, which I think somebody touched on too. But it's called Feminist Teacher, and it's a really practical journal that talks about teaching practices that are feminist. And one of the things that Jackie Rhodes kind of points out is that, well, like, hey, like being nurturing, like if we're going to say that like being motherly or being nurturing is feminist pedagogy, she's like, well, I'm not on board for that, because like, that's essentialist, and radical feminists would be like, no way. Like, I think Jackie Rhodes has gone on to study like really productive feminist communes. And the key there is that they work together in sort of this communal group dynamic, and they accomplish things, activist things and stuff. And so I think that to call yourself a feminist teacher doesn't necessarily mean that you're like maternal and lovely and like, oh, poor kids in the class. And I think you guys understand the plurality of that, whether you decide that that's part of your pedagogical attitude or not. So that's great. Let's see. So cultural studies. Ethan talked about like how the idea of a blog would be good for having students to write about different cultures, and it could be collaborative too. I think that's a great idea. Dana talked about the internal, and I thought this is sometimes hard to kind of think about, but the internal colonialism in composition studies, anytime we assume colonization is over and done with. She said she also sees it in strict adherence to error-based pedagogies. So talking about ESL students favoring one language over another. So I think we talked about this over earlier in the semester, like, you know, the purist idea of like standard American English. Villanueva would say that is absolutely colonialist, and I think he makes that argument, you know, a little more subtly with a little bit more nuance, going back and grabbing ancient rhetorical theory in there. And Christina talked about the Michi and the Villanueva, and she gives this really great story of an Iraqi student who had a hard time writing a straightforward thesis-driven I can't remember now, a thesis-driven essay, because she was like, we don't do that. Like, I don't have any model for that. Whereas our American students who have been brought up in standard academic culture, this is what we've been drilled in them forever, is that this is what a thesis-driven essay is. And we might gripe that, like, my students don't know how to write a thesis, but, like, this is what this is what English and writing in school has been teaching them for forever. So, yeah. Let's see. Anthony talks about creating voice and diverse voices and using good diverse voices to model that. Let's see. Allie talked about students writing argumentative essays where they choose a current side of social issues, but also talking about, I thought that was really important, creating safe institutional spaces for students and teachers, and for considering the value of coming out in the classroom. And I know she's, I think that's an important thing. I know last wrap up, I kind of talked about like the liberal professor thing and the social justice issues in the class. And I think one of the things I want to remind you all is that not remind you, but to have you think about is, if you're having students deal with social issues in the classroom and they're like high school to early college ages, some of them might not be mature enough to think about them. And depending on what atmosphere they grew up in, they're having a hard time. Maybe you're asking them to question a set of beliefs that they've held forever. And so I would remind us all to be gentle with those students and all students, in fact, and create safe spaces, which I know is a buzzword, but it really is. A student needs to know before they take a risk on an essay, right? Like, college is expensive, college is time consuming, all of those things. Before a student takes a risk on an essay, and maybe they're writing, they know, they just know it, right? I've said the F word, feminism or something in class, and they just know I'm a liberal professor. But they really like researched this one issue, like maybe it's an immigration or an abortion, one of these hot button social issues. And they've really researched it and they've looked into it and they want to write a conservative argument to me. I want them to feel safe to do that. I want them to do it not in a hateful way, just like I would ask of my liberal student, right? The same thing. So, but they need to know that they're in a safe space to do that, meaning that I will grade them down for an essay that's all over the place or unstructured or, doesn't have proper backing in terms of research or formatting, all of those things. But then I'm not going to downgrade them for making a pro-life argument or for an argument to strengthen borders or to build a wall. Like, those are valid viewpoints that exist in our world. And although I don't carry them, I'm not teaching you how to think. I am teaching you how to think critically, and I'm teaching you how to use and develop certain writing skills to express your opinions, but I'm not saying adopt my opinion. And so that's when I say safe space, and I think Allie means that a little bit when she says it too. We need to do that for students. We need to create a space, and even if you have to argue, and I think more so than anything, I'm at the point where I'm ready to articulate that point. I don't think I'd ever told students, like, I don't care what opinion you take, like, as long as you develop a good, thoughtful essay, like, you can argue different opinions. And especially you should, if you hold those opinions, you should argue with them, even if you don't think they follow my beliefs. I don't know that I've necessarily ever explicitly said those. I've tried to model those, but I think I'm at the point in my career where I'm ready to just articulate that. So the students know that this is a space that you could say anything. Same thing goes for this class. If you get to this cultural studies week and maybe you loved it and maybe you went, that's not for me. Okay, it's still part of the curriculum. Like, I want you to engage with it. I want you to take it seriously and consider it thoughtfully and think about what place this has, what role this has in your classroom. But in the end, if you decide this isn't for me and you want to respectfully discuss other sides of the issue, then I'm fine with that, right? So there we go. The other big thing that you all brought up, which I think is funny, is the grading contract stuff, the quality versus quantity question. I think a lot of you are hesitant at the grading contracts. Let's see. Who was it? Ethan, skeptical. Austin, maybe skeptical. And Aaron, skeptical? No, Aaron had a really... So that's the other thing is talking about cultural studies. Aaron had I thought it was a good way for high school students to engage in some of that work. But back to... if you didn't get an opportunity to read his post. Back to the grading contracts things. I was sort of enamored with Asawa Nui's grading contract. And so I emailed him and he sent me a lot of his material and I incorporated it in one of my classes. And I think that you all, I think that I briefly touched on it last week. Students were really like, it decentered them. And I don't know that, I don't know that I had set it up correctly. Like, if anybody has ever tried anything in their classroom that they had never done before, you kind of have to try it a couple times. I wasn't, well, and I didn't teach that same class the next semester, but I wasn't ready to take the risk again. I felt I'm a contingent faculty, so I'm not tenure track. So if a student decided they wanted to report on me, because some of the comments that students left on my course evaluations were troubling insofar as they were like, she's not working. And I actually had never worked more for a class, because I spent so much time setting up the grading contracts. And then when we did like comments on essays and stuff, I felt like I was giving more deep and engaging feedback, but I wasn't grading their essays, even though I was giving them comments like a lot and meeting with them and conferencing them and trying to set up workshops. So it felt I was trying to set up this like writerly workshop space, and they were like, I just need, is this an A or a B? Can somebody please tell me that? So that it really is disorienting. The quality versus quantity thing, one of the arguments in the writing field is that our goal as writing teachers of high school, maybe high school, I won't put that mark there, but I think the NCTE carries this, so I'm comfortable kind of saying it probably falls on high school. But in first year writers is to get them writing a lot. Is that the transfer research shows that students don't actively take in everything that they've learned until about 5 years. Anyone ever had a class like that where like about 5 years later it hit you and you're like, oh, that's what that professor says. And the transfer research is actually really articulated there. So it is our job to get students to practice writing, is that writing is a practice. And you'll hear a lot of people say that. And so getting them to write a lot, knowing that like it's more difficult to make them perfect writers in the span that we have them. And it might even be really difficult to take a bad writer to a good writer in the span that we have them. But it is an achievable goal to make a poor writer or a decent writer or a good writer write a lot and really practice writing and practice different genres of writing and practice writing on different subjects. But by the time that they've done that, they've had so many different and diverse experiences that when they're ready to go into real world writing contexts, like maybe in their jobs, that they feel confident and have sort of an internal rhetorical sense of who they are as a writer and of what's going on and what kind of choices they make. Because in the writing world of, say, your job, you don't always have a feedback structure. Like your boss is like, just do it right the first time, okay? Thanks. So anyway, I feel like I've been rambling about this, but it's a good conversation. I think grading contracts are extremely difficult to enact on students who are used to one way of doing things. But there is a huge movement, and we'll read about this sort of at the end of the semester when we get to John Warner's book. And he's a proponent of grading contracts, and there's a huge movement for on-grading and grading contracts, at least in college. I wonder, and maybe you all will tell me this later, what kind of movement there is at high school, and that may be where the gap needs to be bridged a little bit. And maybe it's just not institutionally possible in high school. If it's not possible in high school, they're always going to come into college level writing being discombobulated and go, So anyway, I'm going to stop there, but thank you all for your time today. I really appreciated the meetings last week. And as you're developing ideas for your teaching philosophies or continuing to develop your annotated bibliographies, please do not hesitate to send me an email. And if we need to meet, we can. If we can do it via email, we can. So have a good Sunday, and I'm off to watch True Detective.